What if the reason you have very few friends, or none at all, isn't because something is wrong with you, but because something is rare about you? Most people are terrified of being alone. They fill silence with noise, replace connection with convenience, and call proximity friendship. But you didn't do that, and that already sets you apart. If you've ever wondered why you don't fit easily into social circles, why shallow conversations exhaust you, or why you'd rather be alone than misunderstood, this isn't an accident, it's a pattern. And it reveals 5 rare traits most people never develop. Number 1, high selectivity in relationships. High selectivity in relationships is often misunderstood as emotional distance, arrogance, or an inability to connect. But in reality, it comes from an intense respect for inner stability and personal truth. You don't reject people casually, and you don't avoid connection out of fear. You observe first. You listen longer than you speak. You watch how people treat others when there is nothing to gain, how they react to discomfort, how consistent their values remain when circumstances change. For you, connection is not about shared laughs or constant contact. It is about trust, alignment, and psychological safety. You are not interested in knowing many people. You are interested in knowing who people really are. Because of this, you don't rush intimacy. You're aware that access is a form of power, and you don't hand that power to just anyone. You understand that relationships, once formed, influence your thinking, your behavior, your emotional baseline, and even your future decisions. That awareness makes you cautious. You don't bond over trauma, gossip, or convenience. You don't confuse availability with loyalty or attention with care. If a connection requires you to dilute your honesty, compromise your self-respect, or constantly explain your boundaries, you instinctively withdraw, not dramatically, quietly, permanently. You also recognize that most social interactions are built on unspoken contracts of performance. People expect you to agree, to mirror, to play a role that keeps the group comfortable. High selectivity makes that exhausting. You feel the friction when conversations stay shallow, when emotions are exaggerated for effect, when approval becomes the currency of belonging. You are not emotionally stingy. You are emotionally disciplined. You prefer fewer, stronger bonds over multiple fragile ones that demand upkeep but offer no real depth. That choice often leaves you with long periods of solitude, not because you're unwanted, but because you refuse to invest in what feels hollow. This selectivity is driven by long-term thinking. You aren't looking for people to pass time with. You're looking for people who won't disrupt your clarity. You understand how difficult it is to unlearn habits picked up from the wrong environment, how draining it is to carry emotional chaos that isn't yours. So you choose carefully. You let time reveal character. You let silence expose intention. You wait until connection feels steady instead of stimulating, grounded instead of intoxicating. Number 2, strong self-sufficiency. Strong self-sufficiency isn't the loud independence people advertise. It's the quiet ability to stand upright without witnesses. It shows up in how you make decisions without external approval, how you sit with uncertainty without immediately reaching for distraction, and how you take responsibility for your emotional state instead of outsourcing it to other people. You don't expect others to regulate your moods, validate your choices, or rescue you from discomfort. That inner stability didn't appear overnight. It was built through necessity, reflection, and repeated moments where relying on yourself became the only option left. You trust your own judgment because you've tested it. You've been wrong before, adjusted, and learned. That experience matters more to you than consensus. When others panic at being misunderstood or disliked, you remain steady because your sense of worth isn't negotiated through reaction or praise. You don't need constant communication to feel secure, and you don't interpret distance as abandonment. You understand that solitude isn't emptiness, it's space. Space to think clearly, to recalibrate, to strengthen the internal systems that most people never bother developing because they're always leaning on someone else to carry the weight. This self-sufficiency often creates distance without intention. People assume you don't need them, and in a way they're right, but not in the way they fear. You don't need people to survive emotionally, yet you still value connection when it's genuine. The difference is that you choose relationships from desire, not dependency. You don't cling, you don't chase reassurance. You show up whole, not hoping someone will complete what's missing, but wanting to share what's already solid. That can be unsettling for those who rely on mutual insecurity to bond. Over time, this trait makes you less reactive and more deliberate. You don't rush decisions just to feel relief. You can tolerate discomfort without dramatizing it. You know that strength isn't the absence of struggle, but the ability to endure it without losing direction or self-respect. You understand that loneliness fades, but self-betrayal lingers. So you choose the harder path of internal accountability, even when it means walking alone, even when it means being misunderstood, even when it separates you from people who would rather you stay small, dependent, and easy to control. Number 3. Heightened self-awareness. Heightened self-awareness is not constant introspection or emotional overanalysis. It is a steady, almost instinctive awareness of what is happening inside you and around you at the same time. You notice shifts in your emotional state before they become reactions. You recognize when discomfort isn't coming from the situation itself, but from a misalignment between your values and what's being asked of you. You pay attention to tone, timing, and subtext, and you often sense when something is off long before it becomes obvious. This makes you less impulsive, but also more isolated, because once you see patterns clearly, you can't go back to ignorance. You spend time questioning your own motives instead of projecting them onto others. You know when pride is disguising fear, when certainty is masking insecurity, and when emotional attachment is clouding judgment. This internal honesty can be exhausting because it removes the comfort of easy narratives. You don't get to blame circumstances indefinitely, and you don't get to hide behind excuses that sound good but feel hollow. Self-awareness requires accountability, and accountability limits emotional shortcuts. It forces you to sit with contradictions, wanting connection but valuing distance, craving meaning while resisting dependency, and to hold them without rushing to resolve the tension artificially. This awareness extends outward as well. You pick up on inconsistencies in people's behavior, on emotional mismatches between what's being said and what's actually felt. You notice when kindness is performative, when confidence is inflated, when vulnerability is used strategically rather than honestly. These observations aren't judgments, they're signals. And once you register those signals, it becomes difficult to engage casually. Small talk feels like noise when deeper currents are obvious. You're not uninterested in people. You're too attentive to ignore what others gloss over. Heightened self-awareness often places you in a quiet psychological gap between yourself and others. You see emotional dynamics unfolding in real time, including your own role in them, which makes passive participation impossible. You don't lose yourself in groups easily. You remain slightly apart, observing, reflecting, adjusting. This can be mistaken for detachment, but it's actually presence without illusion. You're fully there, yet unwilling to abandon clarity for comfort or authenticity for belonging, or truth for ease, even when awareness turns solitude into the more honest option. Number 4, low tolerance for dishonesty. Low tolerance for dishonesty isn't about moral perfection or rigid judgment. It's about psychological survival. You've learned, often through experience, that dishonesty doesn't stay contained. A small lie shifts dynamics, erodes trust, and slowly forces everyone involved to perform versions of themselves that aren't real. You sense this immediately. It's not just blatant lying that unsettles you, but exaggeration, omission, emotional manipulation, and the subtle ways people bend truth to maintain comfort or control. When authenticity disappears, so does your sense of safety, and without safety, connection becomes meaningless. You are especially sensitive to emotional dishonesty, forced agreement, performative empathy, affection used as leverage. You notice when people say what sounds right instead of what feels true, when vulnerability is deployed strategically, when apologies are offered to end conflict rather than to take responsibility. This awareness creates distance, not because you enjoy separation, but because you refuse to participate in psychological games. You understand that pretending costs more than confronting, and that tolerating falsehoods trains others to repeat them. Silence for you is preferable to complicity. Because of this, you may appear intense or inflexible. Others might say you take things too seriously, or that you should just let it go. What they don't see is that you are protecting clarity. You know how quickly self-doubt forms when truth is unstable, how easily boundaries erode when contradictions go unaddressed. You don't tolerate dishonesty because it destabilizes your inner compass. When reality feels distorted, your ability to trust yourself weakens, and that's not a cost you're willing to pay for social comfort or approval. This trait often results in abrupt emotional withdrawal rather than conflict. You don't argue endlessly, and you don't beg for honesty. Once you recognize a pattern of avoidance, deflection, or manipulation, you step back, not out of superiority, but out of self-respect. You understand that truth can be uncomfortable, but it is also grounding. It gives relationships structure, weight, and direction. Without it, intimacy becomes theater, communication becomes strategy, and connection becomes fragile. So you choose fewer people, fewer words, fewer promises, because what remains must be real enough to stand without performance. Number 5, uncommon mental independence. Uncommon mental independence is not rebellion for its own sake, nor is it the loud rejection of norms. It is the quiet refusal to outsource your thinking. You don't automatically adopt opinions because they're popular, comforting, or rewarded. You pause, analyze, and measure ideas against your own values and lived experience before accepting them. This makes you slower to agree, harder to persuade, and resistant to narratives that simplify complex realities. You're willing to sit in uncertainty rather than accept a convenient belief just to feel aligned with the majority. You are aware of how strongly social pressure shapes perception, and that awareness creates distance from collective thinking. Trends, ideologies, and group identities don't anchor you. Internal coherence does. You notice when conversations become scripts, when questions are discouraged in favor of slogans, when disagreement is treated as moral failure rather than intellectual process. Instead of reacting emotionally, you step back. You'd rather risk being misunderstood than surrender your ability to think clearly. Approval doesn't guide you. Integrity does, even when that integrity isolates you. This independence extends to how you interpret success, failure, and meaning. You don't measure your life by inherited definitions or external milestones. You examine whether goals align with your temperament, your priorities, and your long-term psychological health. That often puts you out of sync with peers who are racing toward validation you don't value. You don't envy paths you wouldn't choose, and you don't chase outcomes that compromise your internal equilibrium. Your decisions may look unconventional, but they are deliberate, grounded in self-knowledge rather than comparison. Uncommon mental independence also means taking responsibility for your worldview. You don't blame others for how you think or feel. You revise beliefs when evidence demands it, even when that revision is uncomfortable or destabilizing. This willingness to update yourself requires humility and courage, because it strips away the safety of certainty and the shelter of belonging. You stand alone more often, not because you reject people, but because few are willing to endure the solitude required to think honestly, to question deeply, and to remain steady without the echo of constant agreement. If this resonated, understand this: solitude is not your flaw. It's often the consequence of clarity. Not everyone is meant to blend in, build crowds, or move with noise. Some people are wired to see deeply, choose carefully, and stand firmly. And that path, while quieter, is rarely empty of meaning.